You are wearing something right now. Whatever it is, it almost certainly involved a needle at some point, whether in a factory or a tailor's workshop or a home sewing kit. The needle is so fundamental to clothing production that it's almost impossible to imagine making clothes without one. But for most of human prehistory, no needle existed. And the real story of how ancient humans clothed themselves before the needle was invented is stranger, more ingenious, and more revealing about early human creativity than most people ever consider. Here's the first thing to understand. Clothing is not an optional luxury. In cold environments, exposure kills within hours. In hot environments, protection from sun, insects, and thorns is essential for survival. The evidence suggests that anatomically modern humans were wearing some form of body covering long before they were painting cave walls or carving figurines. Genetic research published by University of Florida scientist David Reed and colleagues, studying the evolutionary split between head lice and body lice, suggests that body lice, which live specifically in clothing rather than on the body itself, evolved from head lice somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Since body lice need clothing to survive, this gives us an indirect biological timestamp for when clothing became a consistent part of human life, far earlier than any physical garment could survive in the archaeological record. So what were early humans wearing, and how did they make it? The answer begins with animal skins. After a kill, the hide of any large animal, a deer, a bison, a mammoth, represented not just food but raw material of extraordinary versatility. A cured hide is warm, waterproof, durable, and flexible. Getting from a raw hide to a usable piece of clothing, however, required a sophisticated multi-step process that archaeological evidence suggests our ancestors had mastered long before they invented the needle. The first step was removal. Skinning an animal cleanly, without cutting through the hide in ways that would compromise its usefulness, requires sharp tools and considerable skill. Stone scrapers, some of the most common tools found at Paleolithic sites, were almost certainly used for this purpose. The scraper's function was twofold: first to separate the hide from the carcass, and then to clean the inner surface of the hide by removing the fat, membrane, and tissue that would otherwise cause it to rot. After removal and initial cleaning came the critical process of tanning or curing. A raw, uncured hide will dry stiff and then rot. To make it soft, flexible, and durable, it needs to be treated. Ancient humans developed multiple approaches to this problem, depending on what materials were available in their environment. One of the oldest and most widespread methods was brain tanning, which sounds alarming to modern ears but is remarkably effective. The brain of almost any animal contains oils and lipids that, when worked thoroughly into a dampened hide, preserve it and keep it supple. It became a near universal observation among peoples who worked with hides. Every animal comes with just enough brain matter to tan its own skin. Whether this is literally true varies somewhat by species, but it captures the elegant circularity of the technique, that the materials needed to preserve the hide could be found within the same animal that provided the hide. Smoke tanning was another ancient method, in which the partially cured hide was suspended over a smoldering fire. The smoke penetrates the leather and creates a chemical bond that waterproofs the hide and prevents it from stiffening when it gets wet, and then dries again. Smoked leather has a distinctive color and smell that anyone who has worked with traditional hides would recognize immediately. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites suggests smoking was used as a finishing step in combination with other curing methods, producing a material that was warmer, more water-resistant, and more durable than plant-based fabrics for much of human prehistory. Now here's the part that surprises people. Before the needle, you still needed to join pieces of hide together, and you could, not by sewing in the modern sense, but through several techniques that required no needle at all. The simplest was lacing, cutting long, thin strips of leather from the edge of a hide and threading them through holes pierced in another piece of hide. The holes didn't require a needle. They could be punched with a sharp pointed bone, thorn, or stone awl. Awls, pointed tools designed specifically to pierce material and create holes for lacing, appear in the archaeological record earlier than needles by tens of thousands of years. A piece of clothing laced together with leather strips is less precisely fitted than a sewn garment, but is surprisingly strong, warm, and wind-resistant. Many traditional cultures used laced hide construction for their most functional cold-weather garments, well into recorded history. Tying was another ancient joining technique. Strips of hide or plant fiber, twisted into cord, could be wrapped around the body and tied at strategic points, holding sections of material in place without any permanent joining at all. Some early body coverings were probably closer to wrapped and tied arrangements than to anything we'd recognize as a tailored garment. Consider a large hide, brain-tanned and smoke-finished, wrapped around the shoulders and tied at the waist. It provides warmth, wind protection, and coverage without a single stitch or hole. This is where it gets interesting. Because the invention of the needle, a true needle with an eye through which thread could be passed, is one of the most significant technological innovations in human history, and it happened far more recently than most people assume. The oldest confirmed needles with eyes date to roughly 50,000 years ago, found in Siberian cave sites. Needles of this early period were made from bird bone, carved into shape with stone tools, and pierced at the blunt end. But here's what makes this significant. These needles were small, fine, and precisely made. They weren't experimenting. They were already mature tools produced by people who knew exactly what they were making and why, which suggests the cognitive framework for sewing, understanding that you could use a thread drawn through a hole to join materials permanently, may have existed in some form even earlier. Before eye needles, bone awls were used to pierce holes which fiber or sinew was then threaded through by hand, a process much slower and less precise than true sewing but functionally similar for thick materials like hide. Sinew, the fibrous connective tissue found along the spine and in the legs of large animals, was one of the most important early thread materials. When dried and split into thin strands, sinew is incredibly strong, elastic, and naturally waterproof. A seam joined with sinew in properly tanned hide can be genuinely watertight, a property that Arctic peoples would later perfect into a technique for waterproof boats and clothing, so reliable that their construction methods are still studied and admired today. Plant fibers were also used. Twisted plant fiber cord, spun by rolling fibers against the thigh or between the palms, appears in archaeological evidence from sites across multiple continents, predating any evidence of woven cloth. Before weaving was invented, plant fibers could be twisted into cord, braided into flat straps, or assembled into simple mats and nettings using knotting techniques that required no tools at all beyond human hands and patience. Here's the modern mirror. You are wearing something right now that is the end product of an unbroken chain of innovation, stretching back more than 100 years, from a freshly killed hide worked with stone scrapers, through brain tanning and smoke curing, through punched holes and leather lacing and sinew thread, through bone awls and eventually bone needles, through plant fiber spinning and eventually woven cloth, through every incremental improvement in every culture that ever needed to stay warm and protected, and, perhaps as early as any of those practical needs, to look a certain way in the eyes of the people around them. The needle seems obvious now, but for most of the time our species has been clothing itself, the needle didn't exist, and the humans who lived and survived without it were not primitive. They were, in every meaningful sense, as creative and capable as the people who eventually invented it.